Welcome to Blue Collar Reformation. PBR here today talking about the subject of the Crusades. Now, obviously, we've all heard of the Crusades. You've probably seen movies like Kingdom of Heaven, maybe the Russell Crowe Robin Hood movie that's loomed large in Hollywood over the years. And of course, you've probably heard about it in school and been taught all kinds of things about how evil the Crusades were. And there's certainly a dominant view that the Crusades are just full of blood-boilingly evil things that were perpetrated by Western Christians on poor, peace-loving jihadis over in the Middle East. But there's more to be said about this, and it needs to be explained. And so we've added this to Freak Month because of the modern interpretation of the Crusades and their vitriol against Christianity and the rejection of the culture of the West that used to be Christendom. Now, there's a lot of things to be critical about Christendom for. I mean, obviously, as a Reformed pastor, I'm against Christendom in general and its theological viewpoints and its papacy and everything like that. But at the same time, we have to read history honestly. And this is one place where the history has basically been told in such a way to vilify everything that was done during the Crusades and with a complete blind eye to Islam. In fact, one of my major problems with reading history in the Middle Ages is that it's hard to find an explanation for why things are happening, when they're happening, and where they're happening without the Crusades and without understanding the threat that Islam had for the West. So as we look at this subject, there's actually been some new ink spilled on this fairly recently. There's a guy named, his name is Raymond Ibraham, and he's written two books. One's called Defenders of the West, and the other is called The Sword and Scimitar. And what he's been doing is giving a history of the Crusades that is truly honest and really showing the nature of Islam, how it is similar to today in Islam's patterns of their warfare, the things that they say, but also really making sense of the Middle Ages, as well as the Eastern world during the Middle Ages and how the East really was the center of Christianity. Of the five major sees of the church, four of them were in the East, and now they've all been largely destroyed and decimated. And those indigenous peoples who still live in that region have to pay tribute to the Muslims in the regions where they live. So it's an important thing to see that the Western Church was only one of these five great seats of authority in the Church Catholic at the time. And we've gone through much about the ancient church on this channel, and I encourage you to look back at that information. But you really can't make sense of the Middle Ages without understanding the Crusades in their own terms. So talking about today, basically the modern interpretation, the modern view of the Crusades, we have to think about how, you've heard everything you've heard about the Crusades is always that the Crusades in themselves are bad and evil. That is the just general take that is had by every lecturer, every historian, everybody who talks about the Crusades, is that we all know that they're bad and they're evil, and that it was Christian imperialism and colonialism starting in the Middle Ages, trying to push these poor Middle Eastern people out of their countries and take those countries over. Now, what is argued by Raymond Ibraham in his book, The Sword and Scimitar, page 296, is, once upon a time, the Islamic world was a superpower and its jihad an irresistible force to be reckoned with. Over 2 centuries ago, however, a rising Europe, which had experienced more than one millennium of Muslim conquests and atrocities, eclipsed and defanged Islam. As Muhammad's civilization retreated into obscurity, the post-Christian West slowly came into being. Now that's important. The post-Christian West came into being after the sound defeat of Islam in Europe. Islam did not change, but the West did. Muslims still venerate their heritage and religion, which commands jihad against infidels, whereas the West has learned to despise its heritage and religion, causing it to become an unwitting ally of the jihad. Now, this is an important thesis because basically he's showing that the rise of modernism and its vitriol toward the Crusades is more vitriolic and more angry at Christianity than it is toward Islam. And so what happened was, along with the Reformation, because Martin Luther was so critical of the Crusades, although he was probably the most verbose about the subject of the Crusades of all the reformers, his criticism was then picked up into this common sentiment of the Protestant Reformation that the Crusades were bad without a distinction between the work of the magistrate and the spiritual work of the church, which in fact was the argument that was made by Pierre Viret and John Calvin, is that the church is indeed spiritual, but that the civil magistrate can wage just war. And so I want to point out in the Westminster Standards, Westminster Confession of Faith, chapter 23 of the civil magistrate, where it talks about the magistrate. It says, "It is lawful for Christians to accept and execute the office of a magistrate when called thereunto, in the managing whereof, as they ought, especially to maintain piety, justice, and peace, according to the wholesome laws of each commonwealth. So for that end, they may lawfully, now under the New Testament, wage war upon just and necessary occasion." So it really makes all wars a matter of whether it is a just war or not. Now, this goes back to Augustine. Augustine's doctrine of just war was that you basically had to have two conditions that were met. And the first is that the condition one is that all diplomatic procedures have been done and completely exhausted, and the threat is still at the door. So you have an imminent threat. So you have an imminent threat, and then you have exhausted all diplomacy that's possible. So that's number one. And the second is that there is an imminent threat to the life and property of the people of a commonwealth. So in a just war, you must have imminent threat. So it's the principle of personal self-defense extended to an entire nation. That if somebody is threatening your life or your property, you have the ability to defend yourself with a commensurate amount of violence that would be brought to you. And so this is extended to an entire nation, but to be done only through the civil magistrate, not by the church. And that's the distinction that needs to be made. But the modern view is basically picking up on that Reformation sentiment and runs with it to the point where it rejects Christianity as basically a colonialist, imperialist religion per se. Christianity qua Christianity is basically, in the mind of the modernist, a imperialistic and a colonial religion that is trying to basically take over what other people have. And this is, of course, false, entirely false, but there is more vilification of Christianity, qua Christianity, than there is of the actual result or cause of the Crusades, which was Islam. And we've all heard all kinds of things about this. I remember one of the things that just made me cringe really bad was in the Robin Hood movie with Russell Crowe, when Russell Crowe is describing the crusade that they were on, and he says that after they had backed the Muslims up and they had to slaughter them, he said, "I knew that we were godless." And so that sentiment of basically the godlessness, the false religion of Western Christians, basically is the sentiment that is had among the moderns. So it's just an absolute hatred of the Crusades, but at the same time, an interest in chivalry, an interest in knights and heroes and those kinds of things. But everything is always cast with a modern lens and not looking at the thing as basically the encroachment of violent radical Islam. And really not radical Islam, but Islam in its pure form, coming from the words of Muhammad himself. In Raymond Ibraham's books, he demonstrates the violence and the barbarity of Islam. But at the same time, he shows that there is a consistency, not just throughout history, throughout the Middle Ages, but even to today, and a mistaken way that people are approaching Islam in nation states today because they think that there is a moderate jihad, or jihad is entirely, that made Antoine laugh, moderate jihad, where basically there's a internal battle of jihad, a spiritual internal battle of jihad that is purely like the Christian battle against sin, and that you're having this holy war against evil within, and that it's really a religion of peace and not the sword. Whereas the actual Quran teaches us that what they really mean, which is that is a religion of conquest, and you have basically three options. You either say the Shahada and become a Muslim, or you die, or you pay the tribute. And so those are your three options. And many Christians still live in Muslim lands, and they pay tribute even to this day. That's how they're able to exist. This is shown by Raymond Ibraham in his books, and it's also shown to be consistent with modern statements made by Al-Qaeda and made by ISIS and all of these different groups that are out there today. So this week, I was getting my car smog checked. So I'm at the smog station. It happens to be owned by a Chaldean man. He's a Christian from Iraq. And there's all these Chaldean guys there, and they're looking at this picture of the new, basically, warlord of Syria and how he's all cleaned up. And the guy's laughing. He says, "Look at this guy. He looks fresh. He's wearing a suit. He's got a black beard. It's all trimmed up. He's wearing like a, regular military hat. He looks sharp." And he flips his phone and shows the old picture of the guy. And from a couple of years earlier, he had the big white beard, he had the traditional headdress, and he had the Al-Qaeda clothing, and he's making all of these statements from Al-Qaeda in the way that they would. And these guys are just laughing their heads off because they've grown up with it, they've lived with it, and they've seen it. And we're living in a dream world if we don't listen to what religions actually say and listen to what history teaches us from its own documentation. Having a agenda to push something other than the truth is nonsense and absolutely belongs on Freak Month. This is PPR signing off. Thank you for watching Blue Collar Reformation. We are here to equip you with wisdom of the Word. The aim is to apply the system of doctrine taught in Scripture to every square inch of faith and life. We are on Twitter and Substack for your sake. Links are in the description. Share with your recalcitrant and reprobate friends and family freely. Blue Collar Reformation is a lightweight and mobile outreach platform. Take it in hand and enter the fray. Godspeed.